I guess I would be inclined to start with your time at Villanova, unless you want to go back before then, Jane. But
I'll take a couple of sentences before that.
all right, so you came to law librarianship at Villanova, but before then, how did you get into this business?
Well, when I was finishing library school, I got 2 telephone calls from the director of the Harvard Law Library, Arthur Pulling, asking about, saying he had an opening and would I like to come and be a cataloger at the Harvard Law Library. And he called back the next time and offered me a job. Interviews were much different in those days. Much different. So that was, so I went up and was the cataloger at Harvard Law. And as traditional in the profession, after a couple of years, you begin to look for something else. And Pulling had a reputation for taking staff with him, and he was been forced to retire because of his age at Harvard. And he went down to this place I'd never heard of called Villanova, which had a brand new law school. And he was looking for someone else to come in and help him, and I was fair game because I was already looking. So I moved from, after 2 years, I moved from Harvard, went to Villanova, would have been summer of '54.
Mm-hmm.
And
was that before the law school had even opened?
The law school had been open for 1 year. And Pulling had acquired all these books, but that's it. They were there and they were on the shelves. And I came in to be the whole tech services department, to record what was coming in, to catalog what was there. And we were, at that point, on the top floor of the Villanova University Library.
Top floor of the university library, because the law school building was not complete.
There was no such thing as a law school building. And then we got a legacy that provided the money to build a building. And we moved sometime or other, I don't remember the date, into
the building opened in '57.
Okay, so I was there 3 years in the old building. And we moved into the new building, which was, and the library was built by Pulling standards, which means that it had closed stacks. To get to the stacks, you had to walk through the reserve room. And so when we opened the stacks, the reserve room had very little control. We had very little control over what went on through that. He was told that he had a job as long as he could walk. Unfortunately, that's not what he lost first. His memory began to go, and he had relied on his memory his entire career. And so I had another job offer, a very good one, as a matter of fact. And I went into the dean, and the dean said, well, if you stay, you'll be the chief librarian in 2 years. And I said, what about Arthur? And he says, I'll take care of Arthur. So Arthur was forcibly retired for the second time. And he went, and I became the law librarian. And at that point...
You also went to, you got your LLB there.
Yes. Well, after I had been there for a few years, I realized that, well, Pulling had said, oh, you don't have to have any degrees. I don't. The librarian at UCLA doesn't, but they were a different generation. So I sneaked off to Penn to take the LSAT, and who's administering it but the one person, the librarian I knew at Penn, but swore her to secrecy. But I came out with a good LSAT score. And so I went to classes an hour a day, came in early, and I paid for none of it. I took 2 summers off and went to Wisconsin one summer and went to Northwestern one summer, both of which were close enough that I could get back to Iowa and see my family. And so after 7 years, I finally finished. And then I did take the bar exam, and I passed it. And so I became a member of the Pennsylvania Bar. But that's strange to believe, but at that point I was making more than I would have if I'd gone into practice. That's not the way that practice runs now. But that was just to enhance my ability to be a librarian and to interact with my colleagues who, strange to relate, have more respect for you if you have your JD than if you don't.
And with the JD, you became a member of the faculty.
Yes. Yes, I went into the dean. Things were different in those days, and I said, you know, now that I've got my degree, I'd like a title, and I'd like to be a member of the faculty. He said, oh, fine. You'll be an associate this year, and an assistant this year, and associate next year, and you'll be a full professor in 3 years. And that's tenure. That was tenure until he left. Somebody came in and wanted to see the tenure files, and everybody said, what? That was also true in the library. There weren't any files on that. We had one staff member who came to us directly off the boat from Ireland and just retired after 50 years. And she had an AA degree, but I made her a member of the professional staff because I did not want her to get caught up in the unionization things that were going on at the time, which weren't successful, but she stayed there. And then that was the person about whom I had the questions on her record. Didn't bother me. So I became the university librarian, and then the library grew, the staff grew. In due course, we put on an extension to the library and to the whole building. And the staff, as I said, the staff grew. After Pulling retired, we opened up the stacks, and when they put in the new building, we put the stairwell that's in the middle of the reading room so you could get directly downstairs to the stacks. There were certain problems there that I never did solve. You fight with the same people for so long about the same thing, then you leave and let somebody else fight it. But the reading room, heating and air conditioning was never adequate. So,
so at Villanova, you had substantial involvement with the physical environment of the library. Both you were there when the original facility was constructed.
I had no input on that.
No input, but then once you became the chief librarian,
yes,
then you were quite involved with changes in the physical setup of the library,
yeah,
including expansion.
Excluding the expansion.
Yeah.
And
so that when you came to Cornell and faced that again, you had experience.
I had experience. I can look at a floor plan and tell you where the light switches are, the telephone switches are, and when I came here, I learned to read the structural designs too. As I said one time, all these things for which I had no training whatsoever.
Are we ready to talk about your coming here? I mean, it was 76.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Bittner retired. Search committee chaired by Bill Hogan
I don't remember.
Looking for a successor, and you were at the time president of the AALL.
Right.
So you came, had discussions, and decided to come here. Got the offer and decided to come.
Well, I had seen Harry Bittner at some convention, whether it was AALL or AALS, I don't remember. But he said, I hope you will apply. And so I did. And when I came up here, I had in my pocket an offer from another school. But I came up here and looked at the surroundings and what was going on here, and I said, well, even if I don't get it, I'm not going to cope with Washington, D.C. A friend of mine said, oh, well, but I walked down the middle of the street and if I'm concerned about the neighborhood, and I said, yes, and you're 6 feet too. So, so I came here and had my interview after I had applied. It was a hectic time in my life. My father was very ill, and I left directly from here and flew home out to Iowa. And with shoes that weren't satisfactory for the blizzard that I arrived in. Then I said, that with advice from a friend of mine who had, Morris Cohen, who had moved, when he was president of the Law Library Association, he had moved directly to Yale from Penn. And he said, that was a mistake, you've got to have some vacation. So I negotiated that I would get through with AALL, with a convention in the middle of the summer, wrap that up, leave Villanova, have a month's vacation, and then come here in October. And that meant that at that point, the librarian taught legal research, the introduction to legal research. And so the first semester I was here, starting 1st of October, I taught 2 sections twice a week for the remainder of the semester, which was a bit much, including all the other things I was learning in a hurry.
In your discussions about the position, sometimes those can become an opportunity for negotiation over commitments and so forth and so on. Was there discussion about the building needs at that time with then Dean Roger Crafton, or?
Well, I remember I was having coffee in the faculty lounge, and Roger walked in and he said, well, what do you think? And I said, same problem all libraries have, space and staff. And they had begun to think about space. But it wasn't, I didn't say as a precondition for my coming or any of that sort of thing. And certainly nobody had started to raise money for it, as you well know. And so we came and dealt with what we had. The one thing that I remember when we were talking about space was that Tucker Dean suggested that we could have microfiche, and we could hang them from the ceiling in the reading room and pull them up and down, and I had a terrible time keeping a straight face. And aloud as how I didn't think that that was very practical, and had he ever tried to read microfiche, and he hadn't. So it was a live topic at that point, yes.
Some of your remarks at the time about the difference between Cornell and Villanova focused on this being a law school located away from a metropolitan area, and the effect that had on the needs. Were there other things that struck you?
Well,
I mean, the point you made then was that in a metropolitan area, the school can rely on other collections.
Yes.
As in Villanova, you had Penn and other strong collections nearby. So
the Bar Association in Philadelphia has a very strong collection, which was open, and that was and it was certainly true when Villanova was in its early days. But and so here there were things for which we would have relied on other people as we built our historical collection down there. Here you were self-sufficient. True, we did a lot of interlibrary loan. You could always tell when the law review was doing something in the medical field because the number of interlibrary loans requests skyrocketed. The other difference was that this was much more a research library. At that point, the Villanova faculty, were under no pressure to write. And so here I was very interested in talking to faculty and figuring out what their research interests were, particularly as we were buying new books and building the collection of new materials. When Harry Bittner was here, he had all kinds of money, or so it seems, and sort of bought everything that was around. By the time I came, that was no longer so, and we had to be much more choosy about what we bought, and so I needed to have a good sense of what the faculty research interests were or might become, and that was one thing that was very different.
I'm not sure this is a difference, but it's one topic I'd like to open up, and that is the administrative structure. You spent a lot of time with the ABA accreditation process, and the ABA has a very strong view that the law library ought to be autonomous and not wired tightly into the university library system. Here, the law library is part of a university library system. How did you experience that? As I say, you were with the ABA accreditation operation when you were carrying this one norm around with you and applying it to other law schools, and yet here it wasn't disregarded, but it didn't fit with the bias of the ABA.
Yeah, certainly not the standard criteria that they look for. I really didn't think a whole lot about it. I did interview with Gormley Miller, who was the university librarian at the time, and it was a joint appointment, as I understand it, or understood it then. But it did come with tenure at the law school. The library tenure for librarians, I never did quite figure out, but it wasn't important, at least not to me. One of the man who replaced Pulling at Harvard told me one time, "Oh, you haven't been bossable for a long time." and that stood me in good stead. Gormley was extremely easy to get along with, and so I could focus primarily on the law school.
Were there points, though, of rub where the fact that the law school was really a different environment created at least points of friction? As, for example, on staff salaries or budgeting in other regards, or the nature of the acquisitions, or were you given sufficient autonomy on those or other fronts?
Well, I met with the university-wide social science librarians, weekly or bi-weekly, something, and we went over titles, went through specifically the federal deposit receipts on what we wanted, but there was nothing that said that we couldn't duplicate what was in the main library, which was a problem in some places that had this thing. So we could get all the congressional hearings, and Olin had all the congressional hearings. And we would negotiate on some of the things. ILR was also a question of who got it, and in many cases we duplicated labor law materials. But some things we didn't. And it was my experience that the philosophers, the judicial, legal philosophers went to Olin anyway, a lot of the time, so they could pick up that material up there. And the same was true for the people in labor law. And tax, we were autonomous. We did not try to work with the business school on their collection at all. Because the tax lawyers want it right now and right there. And so we did.
Were there positive benefits as you saw it, being part of the university system rather than totally autonomous?
I really appreciated their what's now known as human resources. They ran the search committees for professional librarians. If they didn't do that, I would have been on my own. That would have been, I know, single, and I had a range of salaries that I knew that would work because they were able to attract staff with these salaries, and I should be able to attract staff with those salaries. And so they did the hiring, set up the interviews, and did all of that kind of thing. That was a great help to me. They also had specific steps of progress towards tenure for their librarians, and that I found very good. We had on the staff, and I guess I might as well mention names, is Alan Diefenbach, who did not have a law degree, and who at times felt very uneasy that he wasn't recognized as well. And so he was very interested in being part of the university system and having that kind of tenure. So for him specifically, it was a very important thing to do. True, you spent a lot of time at university meetings, library meetings, which for the most part, was helpful. And it was a community. At Villanova, I had no community. The university library was very small. The university librarian, this is public knowledge, wouldn't take a U.S. depository. His staff told him it was too much work, so I stepped in and did it. Took it for the law library, and we had to do it right then because we were about to be put in a different congressional district, and I had to get it done when I had the right contacts. And so I became the depository library there, and they got the leftovers. Here we were each depositories, and it was not an issue. But they were...
Now, at one point, you got pressed into major service by this community when you, over 2 years, led the effort to computerize the university libraries across the board?
Yeah. They had started to do this, and I think it soon became clear that they needed more than a computer technician. And as good as she was extremely good, but she didn't carry that much clout. And so for the 2 years, I worked half-time up in Olin. I had my own office up there, and vetted library computer systems, made a determination of which one we would go with, and started.
Can you pinpoint roughly when that was? I mean, OCLC terminal came to the law school the same year you did. Lexis terminal came the year after.
Right.
So computers were beginning to insert themselves into the law school.
Yes, when I came, there were books, and there was a box of fiche on top of a shelf in the reserve area, but there was nothing that could read fiche. By the time I got here, Bob Oakley had liberated a fiche reader. Where he got it, I never asked. I still don't know. But there was a fiche reader when I arrived. Bob Oakley was, I had hired as the associate librarian, and he was in place a few months before I got here. He had worked, for the record, he had graduated from the Cornell Law School that year, but he also had a library degree, and he had worked part-time in the law library while he was in law school. So he was very well-trained, and he knew the library, which I didn't. I had great qualms about how am I going to administer a library when I don't know the collection. Like at Villanova, I had either bought or cataloged every book in the place. And so that was something a challenge that I felt when I came here. I soon decided, well, you just assume that it's here.
Well, anyhow, so computers weren't here, and when you started, or had, just barely surfaced.
Yes. And well, and the
And
Lexus.
when was this this automation of the university libraries?
I meant to bring a CV so I'd have those dates with me.
Well, it
Let's
would
see.
be in the 80s, right?
Yes. It was in the early 80s, 81, 82, something like that. And we had task forces all over the place who were researching this or that or the other. And I remember going to one group, and this very fastidious librarian said, well, we haven't finished doing this. And in my abrupt way, I looked at her and I said, well, how much of what you haven't done will affect your final recommendation? Oh, none of it. I said, all right, I want a recommendation now or tomorrow. But
And how much a piece of this was the online catalog? I mean, was that the
that was,
centerpiece?
well, it was, in a way, it was an important part of it, but was also the organized online receipts, check-in, and all of that. And that was one of the things that limited the system we could get. There was a very good system that was just being brought up in the San Francisco area, but they could not handle 50,000 serials. Notice could. It had been developed by Northwestern. It was set for very, very large systems. And we did have 6 months trial with another company, which were very good at everything except business. And they came to interview one time, and the business manager came, and we went over to see Jay Morley, who was the university's chief financial officer. They had cash only for one more payroll. And so Morley brought in a venture capitalist and who looked at the books and said, no way you're going to make it. They had made a very detrimental contract with the German software company that was never going to give them enough money. Too much of their income, much of the profits went to that company. So we had made a contract with them that was good for 6 months, and it wasn't my idea. It was the university acquisitions librarian who said we could have, we'll try it for 6 months, and we can stop for any reason whatsoever. And that's what we did. We took it for 6 months. We said to them, you've had our name for 6 months. It hasn't improved the situation. We're gone. And then we went to notice. And there was a considerable negotiation with them on costs and lots of other details. But it's not
well, your concern about your first contracting party may have also informed those later discussions.
Yes.
As what do we do if this doesn't work out? What?
Well, it was, by that time, Notice had been in business for a good long time, as computer time goes.
Yes.
And it had been adopted by other large libraries. So, and we knew that we could get directly to them if we had a problem. So, so we got notice, and that meant that everybody knew what everybody on campus knew what everybody was getting. There was one general catalog for everybody, and the catalog had all the joys of computer searching, that you could find out what was there, and you could get the authors and all this other thing. And you don't have the serendipity of leafing through a catalog and seeing other books on the same title, but there are more advantages to it. And then, so we brought it in, and it was adopted across the board. And sometimes I think it now runs the whole show.
But for a substantial period, then the library had a foot in both worlds, right? It had
yes.
the card catalog, and then it had the
Oh,
online
yes.
catalog. And so to do a comprehensive search, one needed to use both.
Yes, we had one librarian here who only lasted a year, but he came in and he had been searching for an old book. I mean, 18th century. And he couldn't find it. Notice, did you look in the card catalog? And I got this blank look, and I thought, oh my goodness. And he went to the card catalog, and then we had it. He had some other problems too, but that was an early indicator. But that was having to remember both of them. And as a matter of fact, everything did not get converted to machine-readable form until 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. It was after you retired.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
There's something called the Harris Collection that was old and primarily documents that nobody was using, so it had a very low priority, and they finally did that one and got it done.
Well, you mentioned Bob Oakley, and one important part of your experience here was as a role model and mentor. And they're quite a string of folks who were associate librarian under you and then moved on to do other things, Bob being
Bob
one
was
of
first, and he certainly did very well. He became the librarian at Georgetown, did a great job there, became the voice of the law libraries for on copyright matters, became quite an expert on copyright, and many other things. He very bright young man, unfortunately, died all too early. The next one was Dan Freeling, who came here from Maryland. Why did he want to come from Maryland? He wanted a wider collection than Maryland had. From here he went to Maine. I had hoped he'd get a better slot. And then he went to the ABA and was the associate to the consultant on legal education, and just retired in September. And then
Kit was here briefly.
Kit Karlik was here briefly. She had a few problems, and she didn't last very long. The staff were very unhappy with her. Then John Haskell came, and a fine human being. And he is now at Idaho, and he's very happy there. He does not interview for other jobs. When people call and ask, he's very happy in Idaho. The children grew up there. His ex-wife is still there. And so he's well set and moved on to a situation in which he's very happy. But it was a conscious effort on my part to train people. At Villanova, I had an associate named Joe Shashelsky, and he went to his dream spot, which was San Diego. He also died very early of echoencephalitis. I still am in contact with his widow and their son.
I'd like to talk about the building project.
Oh,
if you're willing, which has to have dominated your life for several years.
it certainly did.
You were a key figure in the planning and then in the execution. I mean, working with the architects, working with the construction manager. At the time the Jane Foster edition was put up. And that was in part because the library's needs were very much part of the program, but it's also because that was a real talent that you had.
Well, in my view, the library was what drove the extension, the addition, because we were more and more having to shift things off-site or convert
The
it.
collection was beyond capacity.
Yes.
Also, the whole question of student seating and then carols for students.
Yes, the carols were a sad situation. There were only 24, something like that. And the reading room was always a buzz. There really wasn't any other place for the students to congregate. It was 5 o'clock was always busy as people were walking around seeing who's going to dinner with whom. And with the extension, that just totally left. So there was a question of
Also, places for staff.
Yeah.
When Myron Taylor was built, there were 3 people on library staff, and I don't know what your staff complement was. It was more than 20.
Oh, I can't remember. But it was, we had a space carved out of the stacks that housed acquisitions and cataloging, cheek by jowl. And reference just worked out of the reference area and the few stacks behind it. Really didn't have any place to sit down. There was a desk in the middle of the reading room where you sat if you were being the reference librarian. I really don't remember how many we had on the staff at the time we were planning, but we certainly planned for more than we had at that time. And
Well, so you were in it at the very beginning of the planning and design process,
yes,
and worked closely with the architects.
yes, we flew to Boston and back one day. I remember well. And having the experience at Villanova was a great help in what I was doing here, because I sort of knew what the steps were going to be and how it was going to work. And so we had our plan of what we needed, the space we needed, which was what went to the architect with these circles that they draw, of who interacts with whom and where and how. And then watch the plans evolve and get changed and evolve again. We put in compact shelving on the lower level of the addition, and the upper level is reinforced to hold compact stacks, if compact shelving they call it, when necessary. So that was the only way I could provide for growth. And there are carols in the stacks. If you want to be absolutely alone, you can go into a carol down in the lower level of the stacks, and you could rot down there before anybody finds you. And so, which was not true with anything we had before. And there still is a group of carols on the second level, which is not as quiet, but it's very convenient. And the other thing that I fought for was lockers for books, because if people didn't have a carol and they had a group of books that they wanted to be able to access, they could store them in their locker. Of course, they now store their lunch and a few other things, but they worked out well. But that was one of the places where I remember going over to the construction trailer because they were looking at types of lockers, and I looked at one of them and I said, no, I don't want anything that's off the floor. We don't want to have to clean under these things. It's not a gym, and we're not going to have water, so we don't need it. So that kind of detail is something you also have to be aware of.
Well, you had kind of a very practical perspective that, I have to say, with all due deference, most of my faculty colleagues didn't have. That I often remarked at the time that a building designed by the faculty committee would have had no closets and huge faculty offices.
Yeah, they would have big faculty offices and nothing else.
Yeah.
But there were limitations even then because the library expanded into Hughes Hall, the dormitory, which was not built to hold books. And before that, I think I'm right, that in the legal aid offices had already had problems with files too heavy for the floors. So this has been demonstrated. And so putting libraries and their librarian staff and their books into that building was a very careful process. We knew exactly how much weight we could put where. And you'll notice that all the bookcases are right next to a wall. And but we got a lot of very nice space there, and very convenient space.
Other things about that part of your experience here that you find memorable, that you'd like to talk about? The people you worked with, Garrett Zwart or Bob Kent, Chuck Wolfram, who were key faculty people.
Now, Chuck, I remember being at one meeting and somebody was talking about Annabelle Taylor, and Chuck says, that means that the floor load's an issue. that had been a problem. There was a question, were alternatives. And I drove past this work that's going out here now and said, that got vetoed early in the process.
Yeah.
When we talked about that.
There were two options that got vetoed very quickly. One was going down where they're going down right now.
No.
And the other was that the library stacks were load-bearing, and therefore you couldn't reconfigure the library stacks.
Yeah, the stacks were.
And now, apparently, that's no longer a big X through that, but that's quite
Well,
possible.
Stuart tells me that they are, the support beams are going to stay. Is that right?
I don't think so. I think the perception was that you couldn't touch them.
You couldn't
And then
touch
the
them.
architects came in and said, yeah, you can take them all out and the building's still going to stand. Nothing's going to collapse.
Well, my comment when I saw Stuart was, I hope they understand that they're holding the building up. But of course, we ran into the fire marshal. And because we had put in sprinklers on every other row, the verdict was that we could not put books on the top shelves, which was something that none of us had anticipated. They were supposed to be able to, the water was supposed to go through those top shelves. And so that was a sudden surprise. And
What had been the situation with fire prevention before the new systems were put in? Was there any fire protection in the library?
no,
No.
no. It was, so there wasn't any in the building.
Right.
I remember they've now got these little sprinklers in the ceiling of the reading room. John Haskell's daughter came in with me. She said, oh, they're tars in that sky. And I looked up and thought about that ever since.
Let's see. Can we talk about what I'll call your service to the larger community? Your work with the AA, LL, but
And
and then the ABA.
Yeah.
I mean, you were very much involved with the section on legal education and admission to the bar.
Yeah. Well, started in was the law library. Mr. Boyne had been active. He never had an office, but he was always around. And I got on a committee, I guess probably the year after I was there, which was to the exchange of duplicates. And this is the way that the new libraries were building their retrospective collections. The other one that was doing it at the same time was UCLA. And Louis Piacenza was the librarian there, and he and Pulling came out of the same thing with, started working in stacks when they were 16. Grew up with it. And so I worked on that committee, and then the progression was that I was on other committees. Then I became the secretary of the association, and that was in, I think, 1960. 8 or 9 years after I started, there were people who said, only the old timers get in. And I kept saying, I got here when I was, before I'd been in the business 10 years. And the rules were different then, and I remained as secretary for 4 or 5 years. And when I first started, excuse me, I went out and bought an electric typewriter because I had to type the multiple copies of the minutes. We were beginning to get a headquarters in Chicago. Up to that time, the secretary was the headquarters. And so I worked on with the association, because the secretary was on the board, in establishing the headquarters in Chicago. I remember riding in a taxi with Harry Bittner about a year after that, and said, I understand you did it, and we're not in debt. And I said, that's right, we're doing it out of current income. He had also been president and knew what some of the problems were. Then sort of was assumed that I would go on to be president, but that was the point at which Villanova was starting in its extension, and I said, I absolutely cannot do it now. And so then they came back in what led up to being president, 75, 76, so I was on the board 2 or 3 years before that. The thing that I did at that point that I'm most proud of was that I decided that the association needed to have sections. All the private librarians wanted to be on the private library committee because this was their justification for coming to the meetings. And you can't have a committee of 60 people. So I looked at the Special Libraries Association and said, we ought to do something like this. And I got Roger Jacobs to chair the committee that set up the rules for it. And did he follow me immediately? But anyway, the year after I left, they were in place, and I think they've worked out very well, particularly as it's grown and the private sector grew. This was about the time that law firms started getting much bigger, and there was a demand for somebody to do something about the libraries. And I must say that they looked all fungible to me. They were these young, 25-year-old, active, leggy librarians, and they all looked just like each other. Some of them, I did find that some of them were very, here again, I had some proteges that I moved along the system. And so after that, I was on a couple of committees. Chaired the committee that hired the first executive director. Maybe it wasn't on that committee, but I certainly was on the committee that reviewed his performance and suggested that he not be rehired. And that was a little touchy, but I remember I kept the file, and when 10 years were passed,
It's gone.
put this file in the shredder and we were done with it. I think, well, and then by that time I'd begun to become active with the Bar Association. Some days my tear ducts will work sometime. When I got in the library, when I was on the board of the Library Association, one of the other people who was on the board was, oh, her name escapes me at the moment, Boner, Marion Boner from University of Texas. She was a friend of Millard Rood, who had been at Texas and was then the director of AALS. And I believe she mentioned my name to him and suggested I go on a site visit. The first one I went on was, there were only two of us, and it was part of the Middle States. That's what I learned what a GPA was. As I was, at that point, had that little experience with the other half of that's my confused vision of it, the library's half of the law school. But then I got more and more appointments to do it. There are a couple of vital people who decided I didn't know what I was doing, and then I could go on from there. And in due time, I was appointed to the executive board of the law school, AALS. To my knowledge, there have only been two librarians on that board. One was Betty Price.
Kathy Price?
Kathy Price. She was on for a full term before I got on, and I was on for 1 year. And I must have flunked because they haven't had a librarian since. But then I was doing 1 or 2 site visits for the ABA a year. And as a result of that, I got on the accreditation committee, which reviews all of the site reports. You go to a meeting and your agenda books are a full suitcase. And you're expected to have, well, you had certain ones that were assigned to you that you read in detail. And from that committee, I got on the legal education, I was on the library, the library committee that reviewed all the site reports. And then I went on to the, and became chairman of that. And then I was on the Council of Legal Education for a period of time. Then I continued to do site visits for some time after I retired, until Jim White retired. But it was time because things were changing enough, and the use of technology was such that I hadn't kept up with it. It was time that I stepped aside.
Are there other things that that I haven't touched on? I want to take you to Liberia before we're done, but there may be other places you'd like to.
Something went through my mind a minute ago, but it floated on by. I was also, at the time I came here, I was on the advisory board for the government printing office. And the reason I remember it here was that I was working out a handbook for members of the committee or something like that. And Gormley Miller came down and I had this stuff all spread all over this table. I wasn't doing Cornell business. That didn't bother him. That was not a problem. But I think I was the first law librarian that was on it, and they've had a law librarian representative since. And an indication that they hadn't thought much about law libraries is the first meeting I asked the government printing house, well, why don't you put the preliminary print of the Supreme Court available to the depositories, because the bound volumes are so terribly late in coming out. You need the preliminary print. Well, we print that. We could do that. And afterwards, a public librarian came up to me and said, what's the preliminary print? And I explained it to her, and yes, we're going to need one of the, yeah. But it was that kind of input that was very helpful for them.
Liberia?
Liberia.
In 2008, the Washington and Lee Law School sent lots of books to the National Law Library of Liberia, a once flourishing law library run by the National Bar Association. That's how the press clipping read.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how flourishing it ever once was, but it didn't exist before you were there.
No, they were trying to do it. Well, I was ready to have a sabbatical after the building process. Unfortunately for John Haskell, they didn't get it finished before I left. And he had to merge 3 collections when the library moved back into this building. There were one place where we'd stored the stuff that was still in the building. There was the library annex, and there was another spot that came in, and all 3 of these had to mesh. We had a professional library mover do it, so it wasn't. And they had moved it out. But I was looking for something, and the American Library Association had a ongoing program for librarians to take on projects abroad. I learned later that while it technically was the the American Library Association, the money behind it came from USIA. So it was basically a federal project. And what they wanted there was 3 months in Liberia to establish the National Law Library. And the members of the embassy staff said the reason they really wanted it was they wanted something that would promote further the rule of law in Liberia. And I was interested because Milton Convents had done all that work on codifying the he started in 1952 when he took his family over on a ship, and went on until Doe overthrew the Tolbert regime, which I believe was 1980 or thereabouts. And then that was the end of Milton's activity there. But I was interested to see if we could continue that and do something there. So that Liberia held an interest for me. So I applied and I got the appointment. And I think they were surprised. They expected somebody with much less experience than I had. So I went in, and there was this collection of books that they had put together and shelves that they had made. And the shelves were about 6 feet long. They put the books on them, and they all fell off because it was pine, untreated pine. So when I arrived there was this fellow coming in and putting braces in the middle of all these. Bang, 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 bang. So there was, like Villanova, there was all these books on the shelves. So I had shipped my laptop. It was before laptops. It was a little portable Hewlett-Packard computer and a printer did not know about the way of life in librarian. The computer never made it. That box never got through. So I had a printer and no computer. They supplied a typewriter that didn't have a backspace key, and I had a local librarian that I was to train to take over when I left, and a man who was our gopher and anything else we wanted him to do. So we started out and cataloged the collection, which was in the original president's residence. In other words, it was in a historic building. It was a very well-made brick building, and they had put in a bathroom, toilet, washroom for us. So we put the collection together, and the man who was working for us, the one thing you could buy with no trouble in Monrovia was rubber stamps. So we got rubber stamps. He wore it out stamping so hard on all these books to prove that they came from here. And we made some sense out of it. I don't know how many people ever used it. I did have one Brit come in, his company, and I don't remember I guess he must have been a lawyer because he knew what he was looking for. His company was in the logging business, and their equipment had been stolen. And he was looking for wanted the restatement of the law. But his story was that the Army, which was the only enforcement, the police were not an issue, wouldn't go in there unless he delivered a suitcase full of bills. And they had in the meantime, the people who'd stolen it were, just running the machinery into the ground. Nothing like oil or any of that sort of stuff. And so, but he was the only client we had the 3 months I was there.
And does the building survive? I mean, the year you were there was the year that Taylor launched the Civil War.
I was there from January to March, and he started out in that December.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it's still there or not.
At least in 2008, the library as an institution survived.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that it was rated. The air conditioning system certainly went, as everything was. But there was a lot of fighting over a bridge that was only a block and a half from it. So it could well have had a stray bullet now and again. But I don't know. Okay. I don't have any contacts there anymore. The ambassador went from Liberia when things got too hot to keep the embassy there, went to another hot spot in Africa and was burned out there too. But so all the people I knew were left.
Additional questions? Well, Jane, thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's been fun for me.
Yeah.
And this will be available to researchers, to those interested in the history of the school.
Mm.
And I don't think you said anything that you wouldn't want the world to know.
No.
Okay.
Didn't talk about my non-library activities.
Yeah. Okay.